Hey, welcome back to another TouchDesigner tutorial. So today I'm going to show you how to make animations using Stable Diffusion and TouchDesigner. This is actually featuring some new updates to the Computerender component that allows us to create these types of animations. So here's a video, and then let's go ahead and dive into it. So there were a couple core things that I wanted to be able to accomplish with this video. And the first thing is that I wanted to be able to have a perfect loop. So you'll notice that at the very end, we're able to transition back into the original image. The other thing I wanted to do was kind of make this infinite tunnel effect where we zoom into a painting and then zoom back out of it. I'll dive into some of the techniques there. And then lastly, I also wanted this kind of warble effect where, you know, as the beat comes in here, we're able to kind of have the image warp and distort as we kind of enter into the painting. Hey, Torn from the future here. So there are actually two other things that I focused on for this video. The first was being able to change the prompt on the fly as the video was being created. So I changed it from an ink drop to flowers, then into landscape, and then into a mountain, and then back into the original image. The second thing that I was really interested in doing was being able to go through different mediums. So I changed it from watercolor and then into acrylic and then back into watercolors. If you haven't had a chance to check out my previous tutorial on using Stable Diffusion in TouchDesigner, definitely go check it out. I'll go over how to generate images and also how to get that custom component set up so that you can use it. For the rest of this tutorial, I think it's probably the most helpful if you download this specific network, and I'll have a link to it in the description. This network is set up so that if you hit record, it'll automatically start generating some frames for you using Stable Diffusion and then turn it into an animation. It also is set up with the different transformations like zooming and displacing and rotating. We're going to create those transformations from scratch, and I'm not going to go over how to set up the specific video recording process from scratch. But what we'll do is we'll come back to it and I'll show you how to use this specific network. All right, back to the tutorial. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of behind the scenes of, how did I even get started working on this prompt? So I knew that I wanted to be working in watercolors. And so the first thing that I did is I went over to Lexica and I just searched in watercolor. And one thing that you'll notice is that by default, everything kind of looks the same. It's a little unfortunate. Lexica actually changed their default search parameters for this. They're actually hosting their own model now, and so by default it will show you using Lexica's search instead of Stable Diffusion. So if you just go into the search parameters, change it to Stable Diffusion 1.5, now we'll get a lot more varied results. So I actually think I landed on this one right here. I really liked how much the ink was kind of bleeding into the page for this, and it was vibrant, and I figured that as I changed some of the parameters later on, we could kind of be taken to some interesting places. So I looked at this prompt, kind of watercolor on paper, rainbow explosion. ArtStation tends to give some great pieces, and then masterpiece award winning. So you can actually just take this prompt, and I went back over to the Computerender component, and you can see here that this is kind of the first still that I ended up creating. And the one thing that's really exciting is this new slider right here for strength. So this is a parameter that will tell the machine learning model how closely it should try and generate a new image when you're using image to image based off of the input image. And this opens up a ton of really, really interesting possibilities. So what I did, let's go ahead and just look at that for default. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this Computerender component so we can kind of play around with it. And what we can do, I'm going to turn off the background so we can see a little bit better. You'll need to put your own API key in. And then if we do watercolor on paper, rainbow explosion, highly detailed, ArtStation, masterpiece. What a masterpiece right there. All right, so we can just hit pulse and it will generate a new image for us. And I've got image to image turned on, so let's go ahead and turn that back off. And cool, so we've got this interesting painting. Now, the real thing that you need to do in order to be able to generate a movie is to have these, to be able to generate images and then continue to generate things that are slightly similar, or maybe there's going to be a little bit of motion. So this new trick that I think that's really interesting is to actually just take the output and then literally feed it back into the input of Stable Diffusion. You can see down here, all I'm really doing is just attaching this to a movie file out component, and I'll show you how to use this setup in general. We're going to kind of break it down step by step. So what we can do here is if I turn image to image back on and I pulse with the same exact prompt, you'll notice that it actually starts to generate some new content. It kind of varies slightly. I have the strength really low, but you'll notice that the image kind of starts to degrade pretty quickly. So we start to get a lot of aliasing. This isn't that great. It's actually just kind of feeding back on itself, and it almost turns into something that looks like reaction diffusion. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So the real way to kind of create this infinitely changing piece is to actually just vary the seed each time that we generate a new image. So what I'm going to do, I'll just turn image to image back off, go back to our original image, turn image to image back on, and now let's change the seed by 1. And notice that we get a slight variation of our current piece, right? This is super exciting. So if we're able to stitch together enough of these frames, we can start to create an animation. And now the other thing that's really interesting, one thing, because I noticed that you're able to kind of create a feedback loop using this, well, the thing that's really exciting is that you can actually use feedback techniques that you would normally use in TouchDesigner when you're feeding the image back in. So in order to create that kind of zooming effect, literally all you need to do is insert a transform beforehand, and you'll scale it up by a very, very small amount. If you scale it up by a ton, what you'll notice is that it kind of feels like it's skipping a lot of frames. And the same thing goes for rotation. So if we scale up our input image ever so slightly, when we generate our next image, it's going to be slightly zoomed in. There we go. And you'll notice it's staying pretty consistent with what it's actually generating. And so as we start to take this strength parameter, and this should really only go from 0 to 1, and if we start to bump it up to maybe like 0.4, and I'll increment the seed again, now it's going to zoom in slightly, and we have a more of a variation. So the closer this value is to 1, the more random the generation is. So this is super, super exciting. And this is actually how I was able to kind of create that effect as you start to zoom in. So I basically, what I did is I had it continuously saving images. I was tweaking this transform. So by default, I was just kind of bypassing it, and I wasn't doing a transform because I wanted it to just generate some small variations and then kind of zoom into the painting. Okay, so next up, how did I create that kind of warble effect where everything started to warp? I'm going to show you this first by just looking at a feedback technique in TouchDesigner, and then I'll show you how I was able to recreate that using our image input. So for starters, I'm going to just place a movie file in, and then I'm going to make a feedback, and we're going to make a composite, pass this in, and we're going to set this to over. And then we're going to take our composite, drag it onto the feedback, and this is kind of a classic setup in TouchDesigner. So the other thing that we can do here is we'll insert our transform. And we can actually recreate the effect that we were just working with. Notice if I do 0.01, 0.01, you can see that we're scaling in the X and Y, and we get these kind of smooth trails. And that's happening every frame. This is kind of an easy way of testing out what the effect is going to look like. The last thing I'm going to do is I want to just be able to pulse this feedback network. So I'm going to place a keyboard in and set this on the pulse. So I can hit 1 on the keyboard. That'll reset it. Okay, so that's great. We can we can do some transforming. And then you can also see, like, for example, if I set it to scale of 0.1, notice the transform is so large that we actually get these like steps in between. So you can think about each one of these layers as a new frame in your video, and that would be probably too much motion, right? So we actually just want to do really subtle steps between frames, and you can kind of see here we get this smooth blend, and so that would give you this effect of the image, slowly zooming in without having major steps. The other thing we could do too, if I set this back to 1, if you want to do the rotation, what we can do is rotate by like -1. And you can see here we get this nice smooth rotation between frames. And then similarly, if I do like -10, you can see these large steps. So we want slow, subtle motion between our frames. So here, if you wanted the whole thing to start rotating, you could do -1 as you're generating new frames. Okay, so the next thing is, that warble, how we do that warble. I'm gonna bypass this transform. I'm actually using a top called Displace. And before I do the displacement here, I'm gonna show you a separate example of how the Displace top works. So let's just place a Displace. And I'm gonna let's actually just connect it to this kind of base movie file in, so you can see this on its own outside of the context of feedback. And what I'm gonna do is place down a constant, and I'll hook it up, and the image is gone. So what we need to do is set all of the values to 0.5, and basically this is kind of a neutral displacement. Nothing is being displaced here. And what we can see here is that in the displace, it's using the red and the blue values from this constant. So if I take this 0.5 in the red channel, and that's going to control everything in the X direction, and I increase it by 0.1, so now it's 0.6, the image moves to the left. So now if I put it below 0.5 at 0.4, it's going to move to the right. And then if we look at our blue channel, very similarly, if I make this above 0.5, so if I set this to 0.6, scoots it down. If I make it 0.4, scoots it up. And if we try and change the green channel, it has no effect. Now, the thing to understand here is that instead of just using an entire solid color, we can actually use an image for this, where each pixel in this image corresponds to the pixel in the displaced image, and whatever color value is in that is going to displace that pixel. So we can kind of see that in action if we place something like a noise, right? So now we're actually, we kind of need to tone it down, right? So the amplitude of the noise, one thing that's really fortunate is if you lower the amplitude of the noise very, very close to 0.01, notice that we get this gray texture. And so you can see here, we can actually displace multiple parts of the image. But you'll also see that it's kind of stuttery, right? It kind of looks a little janky. So we want to actually turn off monochrome so we can displace in multiple directions. Right now it would be kind of pushing everything in the same direction. And the other thing that we want to do is go into the common section and change the pixel format to 32-bit float. And now we kind of get this smooth animation, or this smooth displacement. So lastly, let's go ahead and increase the resolution of this to be the parent panel size. And we can actually animate this. So we could do the ABS time.seconds times 0.1, and now we can start to get this warbly animation. So this is great. Let's actually do something similar to this in our feedback loop, so we can see what it looks like when we're going to be doing this with our images that we're feeding back into Stable Diffusion. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this noise into our displace, and somehow I'm bypassing that. So you can already tell this is going to be way too intense to do in our video feedback. I'm going to add an RGB key just so that we can put a black background on this. It's going to be easier to see. Okay, so this is way too intense, and there's a couple of reasons why. We can take this displace weight here, and let's set it to 0.01 and 0.01 in both directions. Now we'll get kind of this like smooth, slower transition that's going to work a lot better for our video to kind of warp everything. And then the other thing too is that the noise, you could kind of see this when I increase the amplitude. It has a lot of really fine detail in it. And to have larger displacements, we can kind of increase the period of this. So the smaller the value is, the more fine-grained displacement. The higher the value, let's say to like 3 or 4, now we kind of get this larger motion in the displacement. And then what we can do is take this and scale it all the way back down to something like 0.02 or 0.0, maybe 0.04, and we'll get a small displacement. Okay, so that's great. This is kind of a nice way of being able to preview how this type of feedback works. So what we can do here is let's go ahead and insert, let's kind of recreate that same thing. I'm actually just gonna take this displace and the noise, copy it, and we're gonna put that into our transform. And instead of getting the banana as our input, we're gonna replace it with our previous image. Now, same thing with the noise. We're going to disconnect this from the noise. We just want the plain noise. So if we want to be able to fade this effect in and out, one thing I've been doing is like I'll set the amplitude all the way to 0 if I want no displacement. And then what we can do is when I have recorded enough frames, what I want to do is basically start to increase the amplitude. I'll increase it to 0.1, 0.2, all the way up to 0.8 or something like that. I'm going to turn the background off real quick. And then we can kind of fade in our displacement. So same thing with the transform. And I guess the last thing that I wanted to show in this process is that we can also bring in, to make that perfect loop, what I ended up doing is I generated the very, very first image, and I actually just placed it into a null, locked it. So if this is our starting frame, you can actually disconnect this and we kind of have a saved image in this null. And what we can do is here, I'll put in a cross, and I kind of saved this for the very end. So after we've generated a number of images and eventually we want to start to have the video loop back to the very beginning, all I did is started to crossfade. Let's maybe generate some variation here, so that way we can see that the crossfade has a difference. Cool. So then what you can do is, as you have it kind of continuously generating images, you can start to slowly crossfade as it's generating frames back to your original source image, and that'll allow your video to seamlessly loop. Okay, so that is effectively all that I've done here. So crossfade is at 0. We can bypass this transform and this displacement, so we're not using them. So basically all that we're doing here is we're taking our output image and we're feeding it back in as an input image to Computerender. Now what we can do to kind of generate these seamless images is, I can start by just generating a single image, right? I'll do this will be our starting frame. And what I like to do to be able to have it loop back on itself is to create a null and lock it. And then we can disconnect it, and we'll save this for later, right? We're going to feed this into our cross. And this is going to allow us, after we've generated a bunch of images, to eventually crossfade back into our original image so that the video feels like it's a seamless loop. Okay, so the way that I've set this up is that there's a couple of scripts here, and all these scripts they're just responsible for generating a new frame continuously whenever the previous one is finished loading. So here in the movie file out, let's go ahead and make a new name for this. This will be like our test watercolor vid. And the one thing that you want to make sure to do, so my starting frame, I start with image to image turned off because I just want to generate like a nice looking start frame. Now I'm going to turn image to image back on. And I would recommend starting with your strength pretty close to 0.1 so that you get similar frames. So now let's go ahead and turn recording on. And all this is doing is listening for when the previous image finished loading. And once it's done loading, it's going to increment this seed value and then generate a new image for us. And you can already see here that it's starting to generate some slight variations, and it's not going to be that different when we first start. And so what we can do is we can start to ramp up this strength value, and I feel like at around 0.4 to 0.5, we get a fair amount of variation where it doesn't feel too jittery between frames. But then when you go higher, what happens is that it's basically starting to generate things that are a bit more random from what the input image is. So closer to 1 is as close as possible to the input image. Closer to 1 are values that are going to generate things with more variety in it. Now this is great. We can already see that we're just going to have some kind of subtle animation, but what if we want to start to introduce that zooming effect? Well, what we can do here is we're bypassing our transform and we're setting our scale right now to 1. So why don't we just increase it ever so slightly? I'll set it to 1.01. And then now I'll turn on this transform, and you can see the next image that gets generated is going to be slightly larger. So we're starting to zoom in on the painting. Now, you'll want to do this for probably a lot longer than you're expecting. And it doesn't feel like it's moving or zooming in that much, but it actually takes a lot of frames in order to be able to kind of create one of these animations. So you'll want it sitting on this for quite a bit. And what if we wanted to increase the rotation and have everything start to spin to the right? Well, I'll go ahead and set the rotation to -1, just by a very, very small amount. And then now this piece is going to start to rotate. And what about that displacement? So we had kind of that warbling effect. We could take our amplitude for this noise right here, and I'm going to set it to a very small amount at about 0.01. And then I'm going to notice that we have the displace weight at 0.01 here. I'm going to turn this displace on. And now the other thing that I have done here is in the transform, I've actually set it to be a very, very small amount of the seed in the transform. And that way the noise will animate a very small amount as this increases each frame. We don't actually want the noise animation linked to our timeline or linked to our ABS time.seconds that you might normally use in TouchDesigner. We want it linked to this seed value because you can think of that as like each new frame that we're going to be putting into our video. So now what I could do is maybe I want to turn off that warble effect. What I could do is I'll kind of fade that out, or let's say if you wanted to make it more intense, I would probably ramp this value up between like 10 new image generations to like 0.2, all the way up to like maybe 0.8 or something like that. And then you would start to see that warble quite large. And what we can do is, let's do that a little bit more. And then I can start to ramp it back down, all that good stuff. It'll take some time. And then to turn that displacement off entirely, once it's back down to 0.01, we can bypass this displace. And one thing that I really like to do is to start to change the parameters for these while it's generating the images. So here, maybe instead of watercolor on paper, we'll do a mountain, and I'll hit enter. And now what it's going to start to do is slowly turn this image of just straight watercolors into more of a mountain image. And I think this is a really cool way of kind of creating these different types of effects. And if you take this 0.4 value and you start to bump it up higher, it'll take you there quicker, closer, much closer to the prompt. And I would just be careful of like where you put those values. I found like if I set it to like around 0.5 while we're kind of transitioning into a new scene, that can be helpful. So I feel like, yeah, it can be really helpful to like ramp up your randomness or ramp up your strength as you're about to do a scene transition, because you want to move into new types of imagery. And then once you have kind of found a couple images that feel like they're in a good place, start to bring your strength back down closer to maybe 0.4, 0.3, so that way there's some continuity for a period of time. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. So then to be able to create an effect where we can transition back to our original input, what I ended up doing here is I set the scale back to 1, and then I would turn my rotation off. So now there's no more rotation, no more scaling. And I think for this end part, I actually did scale it down ever so slightly. I think I did like 0.99 to kind of like zoom out ever so slightly to give the effect of coming back out of the painting. And then once it had zoomed out far enough, I set it back to 1 so that it was at a normal state. And it started to basically take this crossfade and bring the crossfade in very, very small amount. So, you want this crossfade to take place over many, many, many frames. So I'm not going to go at the same pace that I went previously. But one thing that's really exciting to see is that it will already start to generate some really interesting content when you crossfade these together. I was worried that as you crossfade these, this might need to be something that would be done inside the machine learning model. But I was actually really surprised to see the results that were generated just by crossfading these types of images together. So I'll start to ramp this up, and you can see we start to get, this interesting looking watercolor explosion that still has mountains in the original scene. And let's make sure we're not doing any rotation or scaling. Cool. And then we'll bring this even more closer to 0.5. And then all the way further and further until we're basically back at 1. Very cool. And then the other thing that you want to do is take your strength and bring it back down to 0.1 so that it basically is an exact recreation of the original image. And I think one of the last things that I did is for a split second, I think I literally just took the original image and then piped it back in here for a second. So that way there were legitimately a couple frames that were just the original image saved into the video. And then I turned the recording off. And then you can hook this back up again. Okay, so let's go ahead and preview that video. Cool. That's awesome. I think we got some really interesting effects in there. And so then the last piece is how do we take this and then set it up to be audio-reactive? So I actually have this little component down here that I've used previously for some of the animations. You can just drag and drop it into your project. And then notice that instead of just playing by sequential, we switch this to specify index. And you can swap out this audio right here with any song that you want. And then here in our index, I have a little reference to the audio analysis. You can go ahead and drop this in. And what it'll do is it'll start playing back the frames at based off of the audio analysis. And we can turn that on for a second. And then all I did is link this to the timeline. So if you go all the way back to the beginning of the playhead, hit 1 on your keyboard, and that will kind of reset things. We'll go to the beginning. Very, very cool. And then the last thing that we want to do is go ahead and you basically just hit record again. Make sure that you have your audio passed in here. This is the audio coming in from this component. And you can record your video. So we can actually see what that will look like here for a second if I play this. Hey, thanks for following along. I'd love to see what you make using this tutorial. Feel free to reach out. And if you enjoyed this type of content, the best way to support me is give the video a like, consider subscribing if you enjoyed it. And I also have a Patreon as well. You can support me there. And there's also a private Discord channel where you can reach out and ask me any questions. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.